I am really looking forward to spending the next couple of hours with you folks online. As Vera said, my name is Anisha. I use she, her pronouns. My lineage is from Sri Lanka. My family come from along the southern coast of the island. My grandma on my mum's side comes from a town called Gaul, and my grandpa comes from a town pretty close by, maybe an hour or so away. Yeah, my dad's side similarly on the southern west coast. But as Vera said, I'm dialing in from Nam today on beautiful Wurundjeri country. So I do want to just acknowledge these beautiful lands and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people who have cared for this country for tens of thousands of years, acknowledge the rich history, culture, traditions that still exist within these lands and are practiced on these lands today, and also extend that respect to the lands that you're dialing in from across Aotearoa, as well as the lineages that you bring to this call as well. Um, I thought I would start by just, I guess, setting a bit of context around this session and where I fit in all of this. But basically, I have worked and volunteered in movement spaces here across the past 8 years. And something that I have noticed and experienced is that the impact, I guess, that it can have on our movements when conflict is untended to or ignored. And despite this, I've also observed in movement spaces that we don't seem to pay as much attention to building up the skills and strategies to engage in conflict as we do, say, campaigning and organizing, which is also incredibly important. But I do so appreciate being able to speak to you folks about this today, because I think not being intentional about conflict really does us a disservice. And I imagine all of us here will probably have examples of how conflict that perhaps hasn't been tended to with care or intentionality or support can fester and can have long-term impacts on the communities we're trying to organize with and build with, the impact that we're trying to have in the world, but also on our sense of self, like on our spirit. It can have a really long-lasting impact. So ultimately, I believe that in order for us to build the power that we need to truly transform the world in the ways that we want to, we need to be able to work across differences in deep and vulnerable and long-term ways. And to do that, we need to prioritize the skills of relationship building, and how we navigate conflict is a key part of those skills. So the focus on this session is going to be really around interpersonal conflict between peers, how this plays out in organizational and movement settings, and the impact of this. And I also wanted to say I don't consider myself to be an expert, not like the people that I'm going to reference and the frameworks I'm going to share with you today. I'm not a mediator, but I have spent a fair bit of time over the last few years trying to think more deeply about the skills and tools we can build to strengthen our understanding of and ability to navigate conflict, and have been trying to turn that into a practice. So I really see today's session as a chance to share the tools and frameworks that I've been finding helpful, and hopefully create space as well to unearth the knowledge that I know exists within this online space as well. Um, and I also wanted to note that we will all have very different levels of comfort and practice engaging with conflict and moving through conflict. There are so many different contexts that play into that. So yeah, I really see this as a chance to reflect and learn together, really. A bit about what to expect. So for the first hour, we're going to be in quite a sort of interactive space together, and we're going to reflect on and discuss our relationship to conflict through a bit of an activity. And then we're going to reflect on the role of emotional regulation in navigating conflict as a key skill. Hopefully we will have a 10-minute break in there, if not just slightly shorter, but we'll try to keep it to 10 minutes. I'm aware it's late for you folks over there. And then the final hour, we're going to talk about the drivers of conflict, like what often sits under whatever is sort of happening right at the surface that we should kind of build up an awareness of, before then talking about frameworks, processes, tools, practices of that hopefully will be useful to you if and when conflict does come to the surface and need tending to, before we check out at 9:30 your time. Please just ask questions as we go. Vera's going to be watching the chat, so just throw your questions in there. If you want to come off mute and just jump in with questions, that's totally fine as well. Really happy for this to be pretty relaxed in that way. Um, yeah, and Vera's also got a copy of the slides as well that she can send around to anyone if you'd like. We can also share a link maybe in the chat possibly as well if people want to follow along. But yeah, awesome. To get us started, I wanted just to run a quick grounding exercise. And this is something that I do at the start of all workshops and things that I facilitate. And I guess to explain the intentionality behind it, I see grounding as a key tool to bring into movement spaces um, to build up emotional awareness and emotional regulation. And we'll be practicing and exploring the skill together over this session. But it's so essential for how we show up in movement spaces and navigating conflict. And it's just acknowledging that our energy impacts others and it has the power to shift the energy of a space. And so, how do we take responsibility for our energy? And I see grounding as a really powerful way to do that. And there are so many ways to ground, which we will also talk about. But for this, I'm going to kind of turn to breath as a key resource. So much ancient wisdom globally that points to breath work as a powerful way to get centered and get grounded. So, I'm just going to take us through a really quick grounding activity together, and you can keep your cameras on or off, whatever you prefer. And the first thing is just getting really comfortable in your seat, whatever that looks like for you. For me, I just need to have my back against my chair. I need to have my feet on the ground. I'm quite short, so that's hard. So I've got books under my feet. So you got to do what you need to do to really just feel settled into your space. And then I'm just going to invite you to raise your hand up in front of you. And what we're basically going to do is trace the outline of our hand with our finger. And as you move up a finger, you're going to take a deep breath in through your nose. And as you move down a finger, you're going to take a deep breath through your nose. So really simple. And you're going to do that in your own time. And I'd encourage people doing that slowly as well. And once we all get around our hand once, we'll come back together. So breathing in on the way up and out on the way down. Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. We're going to jump straight into an activity. So we'll do this activity in breakout rooms. And this is an activity that I learned in a workshop. The training was called Fierce Vulnerability, and it was run by a person called Kazu Haga, who you are going to hear me reference a lot. But he is a Kingian nonviolence practitioner based in the US that does a lot of work, I guess, upskilling movements around navigating conflict, a lot of restorative justice work, and has so many excellent resources online, and his books are really brilliant. So I'll also share a list of resources afterwards with Vera for further reading. But I learned this activity in his training, and I just think it's really excellent. So we're going to start here. But basically, what we're going to do is we're going to read out a few scenarios. And when we read out the scenarios, what we'd like you to do is basically indicate in the chat on a scale of stress where that scenario places you. So if the scenario makes you go into panic zone, that means that it's high, you're feeling high stress, however that shows up in your body. And that looks different for everyone. It could be really activating, your heart's racing, or it could be that you feel really shut down and you might dissociate. So that's 10 might look different for everyone, but it's a place of high stress. Essentially, it's a place that's harder for us to get grounded from or be present when we're in. And on the flip side, comfort, number one, easy breezy, doesn't really require a lot of energy or effort in that space. And five, that stretch is just somewhere in between. You might be doing something you're nervous about. You might still feel your body respond, but essentially you feel supported to engage in a grounded way. You can still bring yourself back to a grounded place. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out into two groups. And yeah, Vera and I are going to go through the scenarios for you. And after each scenario, we'll ask you to pop in the chat where on the scale of stress that scenario might place you. Cool. And we're going to pause the recording for this bit as well, so we can just kind of be open. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Amazing. Beautiful. Thank you all for participating in that. What we're going to do now, kind of building on that exercise, is really trying to tune into our embodied experience during that process. So if you keep that spectrum in mind, we're going to talk a little bit, I guess, about emotional regulation as a key tool for conflict navigation, as we said. But going back to the spectrum activity, and going back to one of the scenarios that pushed you more in the panic zone, more in that 6-7 space. And if you if none of the scenarios really did take you to that place, if you just try and think of something that would put you in that 6-7 zone, nothing too intense, but just something to kind of reflect on. So just give you a second to locate that scenario. And just reflecting to yourself for a minute on these questions here. So how do you know when you are in your panic zone? And more specifically, what do you notice in your body? Are there any particular parts of yourself that are activated when you are in your panic zone? So an example for me is two clear tells for me are my chest is like my beacon, and I've now learned that whenever this feels really activated, when my chest feels hot, when I just notice this part of myself more, it probably means I'm pretty stressed. And the other thing I've realized is that I just don't breathe. I hold my breath. And it just means that I sort of feel like I'm short of breath as well. So those are two things that I really feel and notice in my body, even before my mind can really pick up on I'm feeling stressed in this moment. And if you'd like, you can share in the chat what you notice for yourself. Like, what is your embodied experience of being closer to that panic zone? My left armpit sweats, only the left one. See, I love the specificity of that. I love the knowledge of specifically knowing what to tune into. My tummy gets really tight and rigid. Yeah, 100%. Yep, the gut, heart races, throat tightens, voice gets strained, stomach churns, breathing tight, clenched teeth. Yeah, yep, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, how also noting that panic can be different. It can be more dissociative. It can be kind of losing consciousness of parts of your body. It can feel like that as well. Yeah, stomach feels heavy, breath shallower. My neck and shoulders are tight. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And the next question is just around impact. So, how does being in that zone impact your ability to take in what others are communicating to you and also to communicate with others? So I know that for me, when I'm in that place, it's like I get blinkers on and suddenly I am one track minded over whatever it is that happened or whatever it was said, and the person is still talking, but I almost feel like it's muffled and I'm just trying to sort of catch up. And so I'm not really, to be honest, listening, even if I'm like, I feel like really tunneled in what I'm able to process. And I know communicating with others, I get faster. I'm a really quick talker anyway. And when I'm anxious, it just goes a million miles an hour. I'm tripping over what I'm saying. So that's how it shows up with me. But yeah, would love to hear from maybe a couple of people on the call around how it shows up. How does being in your panic zone impact, yeah, communicating with people and how you receive communication? You can jump, you can put your mic on.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
oh, someone talk. For me, I definitely lose like any communication skills that I have, even though I feel like I'm not that eloquent anyway. But like then having panic, in panic mode, I'll just lose words or I'll just not complete sentences.
yeah,
Um, I was also do this weird thing, like I say what I don't mean. Um,
yeah, yeah.
is like I noticed it like more and more now. I'm just like I'll say something and it's kind of a bit extreme or a bit like I
Mm,
don't know, something, and I normally would not agree with that, but I just say it
yeah,
anyway to maybe sometimes it's in an effort to de-escalate as well.
yeah,
Like,
mm,
just say some sort of lie.
mm,
Yeah. And then
yeah.
I'll feel like, ugh, like why did I even say that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, I love that level of kind of specificity in actually not even just how you communicate, but what you're communicating is impacted when you're in that space as well. Yeah, thank you so much. Probably time for one more reflection. Or maybe actually we can hold the reflection for the next question. But yeah, the thing I guess I really wanted to drill home here is conflict processes. They're both about needing to express and build up a comfort and confidence to openly communicate about a conflict. That is still a skill, but it's also about needing to hear as well. And so, kind of as I mentioned earlier, for me, like my ability to really listen um, uh, it goes really out the window when I'm in an activated place, particularly listen from a place of curiosity. And so, if we're not able to really tune into what the other person is communicating, we're not able to genuinely engage in that process. And it's why it's so important to be aware of where we're at emotionally when stepping into these spaces. Um, and why emotional regulation is such a core part of this work. And so thinking about like what is it that supports you to move from that place of panic to stretch. And again, noting that stress can show up very differently for people. So it might be about trying to bring yourself down, or it might be about trying re-engaging yourself and bringing yourself up back up to a place of being present. And these are things that I find really supportive. So as I mentioned, breath work, and again, sometimes that can be slowing my breathing down. Sometimes it can be I need to go through quick breathing exercises, pranayama practices that really are about actually bringing my nervous system back online a little bit. Yeah, feeling connected to the earth. That's my back, my feet. They're so integral for me. Feeling grounded, moving my body, singing is a massive one for me. But this obviously is so personal to different people, but knowing what actually helps us move from a place of panic to stretch. And maybe if you just want to share in the chat around what tools that you use. Oh, there's also some really great reflections in here about what panic, the impact on communication. Take things others say, do more personally. Yeah. So again, how you're taking things in, how you're listening, colder and less connected to emotions, more closed off, more dismissive and distance. Yeah, absolutely. Get too honest and say everything on my mind. Yeah. Yep. Been there. Get that. Cool. I'm seeing some ideas in here. Animals, petting a dog or cat. Oh my gosh, yes. I had a video call, a therapy video call once, and I do like kind of more body-based and arts-based therapy, and my dog came in, and my therapist, I was a bit like, oh, and she was like, no, this is great. Your dog is coming to you because you're stressed. Pet your dog. So that was a nice permission from her. A burger. I love getting a burger after a bad charge day. Feel you. Counting to 10, dance, use up energy or use up the mind. So choreograph, playing music, something technical that needs a concentration to shift from my mind going in circles. Get outside, yes. Notice my surroundings, absolutely, yeah. Or if I can't visualize in my mind, beautiful. Have a drink of water, binge, make up songs randomly when in an emotional session. Yep, movement, stretching, dancing, yeah, gorgeous. Um, Beautiful. And another just personal question here, and you don't have to share this. This is just something to reflect on for yourself. But how comfortable were you to answer those questions? Like, did you know straight away um, where being stressed shows up for you? And did you know straight away like how to bring yourself back and where you go to? Just taking a second to kind of reflect on that. And I guess context around that saying there's absolutely no shame if your answer is like, actually, it took me a while and I'm still not really sure. Um, the systems that we live within and we're constantly having to navigate patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, they all push us to disconnect from the knowledge of our bodies and our intuition. We are constantly encouraged to go to our head and to train our mind, but not so much tune into our bodies. And so for a lot of us, it's a skill that we need to build and practice. I personally see it as deeply political to make our way back to ourselves in this way. And I see it as a form of resisting systems as well. And it's something we're going to chat a little bit more about after the break. Um, and something I also want to say is I definitely don't want the take home to be that we need to dial down our emotions. That's not it. Emotions are beautiful and messy and so integral to being human, and they are big and they are so connected to the why of, I imagine, why everyone is on this call. It's so connected to emotion. We will be pushed to panic in this work just by being human and just because this work, whatever the work or kaupapa it is that you are focused on is to you, like we will be pushed to panic. So how can we become more aware of our emotions, create space to feel them fully in more supported ways, and practice to move through our emotions more healthily? And this is something that we need to figure out how to build and how we build into movement spaces. And again, when I'm saying emotional regulation, reframing that to what do I need to do to get to a place where I can really hear you? Gorgeous. Oh my word, we're basically on time. This never happens. Amazing. Cool. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back at 8:40, just under 10 minutes. And we'll yeah, kick off with the next hour. Thanks, everyone. Back. Great. Awesome. Well, I might keep us going then. Um, yes, so wanted to start this next session, kind of following next section, following a thread that we touched upon, I guess, before the break. But I guess thinking about leaning into being more intentional about around how we address conflict and shifting our relationship to conflict as political in itself, actually, and as a decolonial act in itself. And to illustrate this, I really wanted to share a snippet of a podcast between Kazu Haga and Carlos Saavedra, who is part of an organization called Aini Institute. And they sort of speak to this, so Kazu speaks to this. And annoyingly, it doesn't seem to be working on my laptop, so I'm going to play it through my phone. Vera and I tested it, and it did seem to work. But if for any reason it isn't working, please just mention it. Let us know in the chat. I will have the slides as well with what's being said. But if the recording isn't clear, we can just turn the recording off, and I can read the slides. All right.
Justice work. I was just having coffee or chai with a woman named Sujatha this morning, who's a pioneer in restorative justice work, and she was talking about how every indigenous community, if they look back far enough, had practices of responding to harm in a way that heals relationships. And because of colonization, because of patriarchy, because of all these systems, a lot of them have lost access to those teachings and those ways of being. But if we just provide space for every community to go back far enough into their own lineage, we have these practices, like we know what it means to live in community with each other, right? And so can we create a system that allows empowerment from the ground up to look back into our own history, to remember at the end of the day, to me, nonviolence is just about learning how to be in relationship with ourselves and relationship with each other again. And we all know how to do that. And so can we create a system where we can all just remember what that feels like and what that looks like?
Oh my God, so good. So good.
That's Carlos. Actually, it's really mostly Kazu in that, but I'll also share a link around to the rest of that podcast. But yeah, I wanted to acknowledge Kazu says a lot of communities have lost access to teachings and ways of being, which of course does have truth to it. But also acknowledging Indigenous communities and peoples who do still have a very strong sense of culture and protocol around conflict, but aren't necessarily supported in wider or more colonial institutions to lead with Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing. So yeah, I think what I found really powerful about this recording is to me, Kazu was calling for a re-indigenization of how we work and the systems that we live within. And I guess as a flow on for that, I wanted to share a little bit about a conflict transformation fellowship that I was a part of co-facilitating over much of last year. That was called Tending to Our Relationships for Climate and Land Justice. And it sort of builds on what Kazu was saying, but this was a 8-month fellowship with First Nations and Pacifica people and people of color active in the climate and land justice space. And I co-facilitated this alongside my good friends, Tarokura, who is actually one of the former co-directors at Action Station, and Laniuk, who is a Larakia, Kungarakan, Gurindji French political creative and poet. And the focus of this fellowship was around building up our capacities to engage in and transform conflict in the climate and land justice movement spaces on this continent. And there were a few people actually based in Aotearoa that flew over and participated as well, which is really wonderful. And so this was really the premise of the design. And I'll read this out. This is just a little photo of a box of text that says, colonialism didn't just steal land. It rewrote the story of nature. It taught us to see the earth as something to dominate, not something to belong to. The fight for decolonization is the fight to unlearn this lie and rebuild our relationship with the planet and with each other. So the premise of the design of the program really rests in recognizing colonization as a key site of conflict that impacts how we relate to ourselves, each other, and the spaces that we create, as well as the earth. And so whether we're aware of it or not, the reality is this plays into conflicts that emerge within the climate sector here in Australia, and I imagine might be in your context as well. And so with that in mind, the fellowship was designed really intentionally from this point of understanding. Yes, we can support people to develop skills and tools, and we absolutely need to do that. But how are we also bringing in an approach and practices that speak to and attempt to tend to this broader systemic side of conflict? And so as part of the design of the program, we lent into what Tarokura called the Wakahoro model. And this is really drawing from their own Maori lineage and the work of other Maori scholars that they know of and that they have learned from. And it really acknowledges that we need both decolonization and re-indigenization, as well as a relational space between those two things to truly transform conflict in the climate and land justice space. And to be a bit more explicit about what I mean when I say decolonization and re-indigenization, and I'll just read this out. So decolonization is the work that we do to address the open wounds of colonization through redress, reparations, and repair, to reduce the harm of colonial systems on people and land, to shift power and resources from colonial institutions and ideologies to Indigenous nations and knowledges. Re-indigenization is the work we do to back and support the return of Indigenous lands to Indigenous nations, recognize and uphold Indigenous laws, sciences, and spiritualities, reawaken and enliven Indigenous languages, practices, and knowledges. So as part of our fellowship, participants were supported to draw from their own lineages or be inspired by nature to develop their own frameworks, tools, practices, we call them theories of return, to transform conflict. In line with Kazu's point about there already being so much wisdom that exists that we just need space and time to tap into. And another part of this this whole program is that our fellowship was run alongside another fellowship and in relationship with another fellowship that was facilitated by two wonderful humans who we call the Becks, Beck Ronson and Beck Lang, who work specifically with climate leaders in the movement to unpack conflict and conflict within the space, but also start to also unpack what decolonization means in practice. And that relational space, I mean, these programs were co-designed. Well, the whole structure was co-designed. This model was co-designed, and there was regular meetings, regular debriefs, and really deep learning and knowledge sharing between our groups the whole time. And I will say that perhaps initially we sort of had set it up as like our cohort is leaning into re-indigenization and the other cohort is leaning into decolonization. The big learning that we had is you can't separate the two, and actually they need to be happening at the same time in all the spaces that we're in, including the spaces with First Nation specific and people of color. We also need to be decolonizing how we are how we are in spaces as well. But I wanted to share a little bit of what came out of it, in hopes that I guess that sparks inspiration for you folks, or there's learning to draw from it. And I wanted to start off actually with, these are the scholars, the Maori scholars that Sorokura drew their learnings from to develop the Wakahoro model. And I will share these slides around so you folks can access this as well. But yes, wanted to start with, I think my big learning from the process of the last year, which is that to truly transform conflict, we need to be working and building up a greater level of awareness across these three levels that we exist in. And at any given time, most likely all of these three things are coming into play, and we're doing ourselves a disservice if we only focus on the one. So personal, what am I holding? How are my traumas being triggered? In our breakout, someone mentioned about the stories of self that are sort of, being activated. Building up a greater awareness of that. Relational. What is the strength of our relationship? Also to the breakout room discussion, what history or context exists here? What stories do we hold about each other because of that history and context? And how will that impact us? What power dynamics exist here as well? And then lastly, systemic. How are the systems that we are living under impacting this conflict? And that might be at an organizational level, but it might be at a much bigger macro level. How does white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy play out in, how is that existing in this moment, in this conflict? And I find that sometimes that one can be the most abstract, but when I was thinking of an example, the one I came to was that I've been with my partner for 10 years. And as a brown woman in relationship with a white man, we've had to navigate the dynamics of an interracial relationship, which can be tricky. And even if it's him and I, with a decade of being together in a deeply trusting relationship, there is no one I trust more than this man, trying to navigate a conflict, it can be helpful for us to recognize, like pause and recognize that there are bigger systems that we exist within, that we carry in our bodies, to understand why a relatively simple or small thing can feel so heavy in a moment. So I think when we think of conflict transformation, our minds automatically go to how do we repair when a conflict happens and spills over? And that is definitely a skill to build. But I think part of knowing how to repair is to build up our skill and our awareness of all that is happening under the surface of a particular conflict. And it doesn't mean it's on us to address or shift all of that, but I think it does help us figure out how to respond. I also think that if we are recognizing that there are bigger things at play, it reframes tending to conflict as a need to be proactive rather than reactive. We need to be continuously working at all three of these levels, on ourselves, on our relationships, and dismantling harmful systems in all that we do in order to really transform the conflicts and the movement spaces that we exist in. To make this a bit more concrete, I wanted to share some of the frameworks and processes that came out of the fellowship, grounded in people's lineages and inspiration from the earth as well. Because I think they really show how broad you can really go when you're thinking about how you want to transform conflict in your particular movement context. And I think they also really beautifully show how you can work with these levels. So the weaving Larakia futures. So yes, Laniuk, Sayan, and Shana are all Larakia women. They have been leading a campaign over the past year or two now to protect their country from military housing being built on a sacred area of land, and are having to navigate the sort of historical tensions that exist within communities. And what they've designed is actually um, a uh, a process of focusing on strengthening relationships grounded in reconnecting back to Larakia practices as a key way to start tending to conflict and caring for their land. And yes, it has received funding, which is really exciting. Maybe people actually went to this. Some people might have actually gone to this or maybe known of this one because it did happen in Aotearoa, but Together for Te Taiao, Sorokura, Nicole, and Tina, they actually ran this. So this happened. They delivered a 100% gathering for treaty and climate justice workers in Taranaki, and again, lent into existing frameworks that already exist within their culture. But the thing that's really beautiful hearing them speak about this was, multi-day gathering, leaning into big, heavy topics that obviously impact deeply, people deeply care about stepping into that space, but the way they lent into art and they lent into Indigenous healing practices woven throughout how they chose to facilitate that space, knowing the way that supports building relationships and people to stay grounded. I love this one, seasonal leadership model. These two young people worked at an organization called Tomorrow Movement when they developed this. And it was them acknowledging that burnout is a key driver of conflict in movement spaces and our ability to be able to navigate conflict. And so they actually developed this gorgeous cyclical leadership model that essentially seeks to normalize leaders not it was based on polyamory and this idea of a relationship escalator where relationships the way they described it is the expectation is you get into a relationship and you just go up the escalator and then you die, or you break up. That's the way they described it, which I thought was really funny. But essentially the expectation of leadership is that you just keep going until you crash, and from that point the conflict that occurs. And so they want to normalize leadership being cyclical, that you step away and you have planned moments of rest to step away, that you're organizationally prepared for others to step in. And yeah, that's inspired by the seasons, but also their lineage in polyamory, I guess, and their exploration of polyamory. Yep, these folks, Beck, Hasmukh, McCoy, working at Sunrise and Climate Action Network in Australia, they do a lot of cross-cultural convenings, a lot of complex coalition building work. And the thing that they really outlined is how to be more intentional about setting up the container of these spaces where people come together, and drawing from the coconut, which they all found connections to within their lineages, um, to be inspired around how to create spaces that are boundary but are still nurturing as well. And they sort of break down the what makes up a coconut and kind of assign it to how you would actually set a space up to be more nurturing and more able to hold conflict. Woven Wisdoms, Tiana and Mary, also two people living in Aotearoa at the moment. I think what was really beautiful is their work really centered on relationship, and I guess addressing larger contexts that might exist between their communities, and how by modeling a relationship of deeply caring about each other and working together on land justice, climate justice, the flow-on impacts that can have to broader communities, to see that type of relationality modeled. Yes, so I mean we're hoping that we'll be able to share more detail on each of these the idea is to be able to share them back out into movement spaces. But hopefully they give you a bit of an idea of actually how deep and how broad you can go when you're thinking about conflict, and inspire you to think about the lineages that you can draw from as well, to inspire how you might approach that in the spaces that you move in. But we are also going to talk about some tools and some frameworks and processes. So when conflict does occur, when it comes to the surface, and when there is repair that needs to happen, what are the things we can turn to resource ourselves? And I'm just going to share some things that I've found helpful, basically. And again, we'll also share these all around after as well. But this first one, so this is a model that Kazu Haga adapted from a model that he learned from his nonviolence communication teacher, Miki Kashtan, and he calls it the conditions for creative conflict. So if we look at the bottom, relationships. So obviously, what are the strengths of the relationships that exist in any given conflict situation? Skills, how skilled are the people involved in active listening, in emotional regulation, in communicating, in knowing when to pause if things get heated. What's the level of skill that exists within this context of conflict? And then structure. Is there a set process already about how conflict will be navigated in this particular circumstance? Are there external structures that we can lean on, like facilitators or mediators, to step in? And what he says is you only need 2 of these things to move through conflict in a supported way. So really using this as a tool to assess where you're at in terms of a particular conflict and what you might need, and how you can, if you're going in and you think, you know what, we've got really good relationships, but I am not confident in our level of skill, I'm not confident in my level of skill, maybe the thing you could look at is there a structure that we can bring in? Like, can we have a talking stick that we pass around to make sure that we're really communicating well? Can I, and we'll go through some clear processes that really map out how to move through a conflict as well. But what can we bring in knowing that I'm not feeling confident about our skills, but I know we've got relationships? And he also has this quote, which I think is really wonderful in relation to this model, where he says, we should only call on systems and structures when necessary, as opposed to relying on them as a default. If we trust each other and have some basic skills, we should be able to manage conflict without a mediator, without calling the police, and without creating more bureaucracy to manage it. And again, I love that, because yes, let's use the structure, let's build up our skills while we build up our confidence. But the ultimate goal is, let's build up our relational capacity to be able to hold conflict. Relationships being the key goal. So this, I feel like, is a great example of what structure could look like. And this is a conflict engagement process, or system as it's called, that is used by a network of organizations called the Fierce Vulnerability Network. And they describe themselves as a constellation of direct action teams positioned at the intersection of racial healing and climate justice. And they're based out of the US. And they've essentially developed a handbook for organizations or collectives that want to be part of their network, that really kind of spells out how they are together. And as part of that is included this conflict engagement system. So this is how we are when things get tough. Like, they've explicitly kind of spelt that out, so there's no gray. And so to go through each of these steps, and I've actually used this model before in a situation that I was co-facilitating with a group of friends that were moving through a conflict. Step 1, we spent a lot of time talking about, which is around developing that awareness. So before even stepping into the conflict, everyone is encouraged to tune in, what's happening at a personal, relational, and systemic level here. And self-empathy. How do you not beat yourself up for what you're feeling? Because that's not going to really give yourself any space to actually be genuine about what it is that you're feeling. So giving yourself that space to develop that awareness and empathy. Step 2, releasing the charge so you can get to a place of empathetic listening. So again, we talked about this. What does emotional regulation look like to you? And is that something you're doing alone? Is that something you're doing with someone else? You know, are you having a big vent before you step into the call, so you can get the petty stuff off of your chest? My friends and I call it the petty pool. Take a little dip in the petty pool, get back out, dry yourself off, and then you're ready to engage in a way that is more grounded. Whatever it is, how are you releasing? You know, you've brought up what it is you're feeling, and how are you releasing that? How are you moving through that? So you can get to a place of being able to hear the other person with empathy. Step 3, preparations for dialogue, is really like, what are the things that need to happen to prepare for people to come into the space? And so we talked about this in my breakout room. Deborah shared some really great examples around picking a neutral space and how important that is. I have been in situations of not being in a neutral space, and compared to a neutral space was a big made a really big impact. But what environment are you having this conversation in? You know, is it in a boxed up office room that you know, is really hot, and people can hardly fit in there, you know, or are you sitting by a river, and are you you know, feeling the earth beneath your feet as you're sitting down? Are you hearing the water running? I think something that I've learned a lot of the last year, and I'm trying to really take in, is that land can be a co-facilitator, and is a co-facilitator if we lean into that. So yeah, where are you holding these dialogues? Deborah also mentioned, I think, that someone hadn't eaten before coming. So it's like these things, like what's have people eaten? Is there food? Are there fidget toys? Like, what are the ways to make people feel like they can bring themselves into the space, knowing how hard it is to step into these dialogues. And then actually beginning the dialogue. So actually moving through a process of having the conversation. And there are a few things that they spell out as part of this process. The thing that I really like is they say that at any point in the dialogue, you know, if things get heated or if it's needed, you can go back to step 1. So at any point you can be like, we need to pause this. Can we just have a moment? And then like back to step 1 and all the way down to step 4. And having used this model, we definitely did that. And it's needed, like giving yourself permission to have a circuit breaker, as opposed to feeling like, wait, we've set this meeting and I need to sit in this room now and I have no escape, you know, like seeing this as cyclical. Something that we found really helped as well is, and I guess this is a bit of structure that can be put in place, but we had a model of listen, pause, reflect what you've heard, pause, and then respond. It's actually used quite commonly in relationship therapy, like couples counseling. And it was, again, really powerful because it just made people slow down and actually check understanding with the other person. And what we found sometimes is people would be like, actually, that's not what I meant. And it just meant, okay, there's been a misunderstanding. It also helped people realize that there was more, actually, that it's like, yes, but actually it's also this. So really encourage that piece of structure there as well. Yes, step 5, supported dialogue. So say you've tried to have direct dialogue and it's feeling like there isn't a way through, or perhaps direct dialogue doesn't feel like an option based on the context of the situation. What does supported dialogue look like? And that's really talking about the role of facilitators. And another thing, yeah, we spoke about in the breakout room as well was thinking about the clarity around roles for a facilitator, and making sure the facilitator really understands that as well. It's like, is it that you want another party to be a witness to what's happening? Is it that you want the other party to actively support the conversation? What is the role of that person, and making sure they really understand it as well, considering the relationship of the facilitators. And we talked about how different people feel a different level of comfort around relationships. Some people feel like they're able to engage more if they have a closer relationship with the people engaged. They know the people, have some of that context, and some people feel like actually being more removed as a facilitator allows more neutrality as much as is possible compared to being in a relationship. So having those conversations and figuring out what facilitator makes sense and that the facilitator feels comfortable with that as well. And the last step is outside support. So it goes even further. So you've tried those things. And what are the other processes that could be used? And they talk about community circle processes, which I haven't personally been a part of, but they sort of talked about like fishbowl type structures where people might be having a conversation in the middle and people might be witnessing on the outside, and structure around people coming in and out. But they also talk about expert facilitation. At what point are you like, let's call in someone who is deeply trained, who has experience, who we can be confident can support us through this. So it shows these different levels of how things can escalate and therefore how the support can escalate as well to meet that. I will share a link to this. This book they have the entire PDF online free to access, and there's so much other stuff in there that it's just really great for movement spaces as well. This next tool is a conflict mapping framework that I learned from a woman called Noura Mansour, who is the National Director of Democracy in Colour here in Australia. And it really invites us to extend curiosity when we are stepping into conflict. So starting with position, so a clear demand or ask, usually the thing that is that has been communicated outwardly. Interests, the underlying reason for the demand, and the base layer need. So the core of the conflict, the basic human need or values that is being activated in any moment. So as an example, position, don't kick the ball against my house. That's the thing that might be yelled out in a moment. The interest, I don't want my window to be broken. Might not be said, but that's what's underneath that. And the need, I need safety and protection. So, I've got a giant hole in my window. I've got access into my home. Now I feel afraid. I feel unsafe. So what is the deeper need there? We can often react to the position, but how do we extend curiosity to better understand the need? And I can't stress enough how much emotional regulation plays a role in this. And I think people were commenting in the chat to that effect as well. I know that my communication is my ability to really hear and then be curious is greatly impacted by how grounded I feel in any given moment. So again, a tool that can be used to interrogate what's happening a bit further, to then develop empathy, to know how to step into a conversation, or at least develop understanding to be able to step into a conversation. And lastly, I just wanted to share a few learnings that I've been reflecting on over the last year around conflict that occurs in group spaces. And the first one is, I guess, around the role of multiple facilitators. And this is, again, more around how we set spaces up. But just the power of having multiple facilitators in a space and not one person having to hold that entire burden. Because with multiple facilitators comes multiple roles and multiple relationships that you can draw on. So with my co-facilitation with Siroko and Laniuk, we all held different positionality within the space at any given time. And we all held different relationships with the cohort as well. And so having multiple facilitators really creates the potential for people to be able to step in and step out at different moments to best respond to whatever is happening. The other learning around multiple facilitators is actually how are you developing and bringing in practices as facilitators, practices and rituals that help you really step into the space as well. It's not fair to expect the group to step into that without you stepping into it as well. And we developed rituals that we would do every morning, really, to just kind of come in, reset, before then stepping in. Like we were holding each other before stepping into space where the expectation is holding the group. The second one is a reflection I've really been sitting with, and it's there's a really excellent article, also Kazuhaga, that I will share around that goes into this in more detail. But essentially, in group spaces, what would it look like if we moved away from norms and more towards asking how we want to be when things get hard? Like what happens when things get tough, and how do we surface that question at the beginning? I will say, like, I'm not, I don't want to poo-poo norms. Like I'm a big believer in making values visible, talking about how those values reflect as behaviors when we come into group spaces, and so having that shared understanding. But it's more, how do we apply that intentionality to this question of how do we want to be when things get tough? Um, because what we tend to do, I think, in movement spaces, and I'm sure we've all done this or been a part of spaces. I certainly have done this and been a part of spaces where we sort of stop by being like, okay, here are the norms. And so, step up, step back, one mic only, think of your power, the sorts of things that come up in spaces. And what we sort of unintentionally do is we create a set of rules. But we don't really have a discussion of what happens when people break those rules. And people will break those rules, because you are also asking people, we are asking people to unlearn patterns of behavior and engaging, in an afternoon that we're all going to be together. So what would it look like to normalize conflict in group spaces and have these conversations up front? Especially knowing the intense work that we do. What would it look like to start a session saying, hey, look, I just want to acknowledge that we're all coming in with our different perspectives and different experiences here. And the likelihood is that we're not always going to agree, and the conflict may come up. So when it does, how do we want to handle that? And some of the questions that you can bring into that space, if a conflict comes up in this space, how do we want to respond? Is there a moment where we feel like we want to take a conflict out of a group space into a more personal space with those involved? Do we feel like it's important actually for us to discuss what happens together? Might that be dependent on context? And so if so, how do we check in on what feels right? If someone leaves the space, or similar to that scenario, how do we want to respond to that? How do we want to communicate with them in ways that honor them and also honor the group? And this is where drawing on existing processes like the Fierce Vulnerability Network can be really useful. So as well as grounding in your norms, how you grounding in a process that people can automatically and immediately go, okay, this is what we're going to do. In that scary moment when things go wrong, we have a bit of a map that we can at least model our way through rather than it being completely gray. And the last one, which I think is like one of the trickiest ones, and I will say up front, I have not nailed this, but I thought it was important to name it, is asking yourself the question, now or later, being comfortable without a resolution if the space doesn't allow that in that moment, assessing what can really be achieved and what needs to be come back to when there is more space. Generally in conflict, rushing to a resolution or repair, moving from that place of panic, and just wanting to kind of make things right again, before people are really ready, can actually cause more damage as well. And I know that for so many of us that come together in group spaces or convene or have conferences or whatever it is, the way we come together, it can be so few and far between when we have that opportunity. Often it's one convening in a year for a few days. You have a clear purpose connected to impact around that convening. It's time sensitive. You won't get this chance again. There's all these pressures attached to that. And if you're facilitating and coordinating that, on top of that, you've got the logistics and holding space for others to consider. And so you just may not have the capacity to go deep on a conflict that has occurred in a space. So the question that I feel like is important to get comfortable asking is what is being raised, is the concern that's being raised something that can be shifted in this moment? Or is it bigger than the space itself can hold? And as an example of this, I was delivering this workshop a couple of years ago online, and I shared this really, really excellent conflict transformation processes grounded in Aboriginal knowledge. And as I was sharing it, one of the participants actually interrupted me and said, and just asked a question, said, I just need to stop you. Like, can I ask if you've had permission to share this? And I had this moment where it was so jarring. And the first thing I thought was I just felt so mortified because I thought, oh God, I haven't. I I read this in a book and I found this online, so I assumed it was in the public discourse, but I didn't even know the need or the protocol to follow to actually reach out to that specific community group and ask for permission. And it was this moment of feeling activated. I literally feel it, I can feel it right now. Um, and trying to figure out sort of how to respond. But it was also such a clear moment of, okay, this is something that I can address in this moment. And so immediately sort of acknowledging the concern that was raised, thanking the person for raising it, apologizing, and just making it really clear that, we can move on. We don't have to continue with talking about this example. I will remove these from the slides. I won't share that around afterwards. And I commit to not sharing this example until I've gone through the process of figuring out how to connect with this community and seek permission to use this. And instead actually then went through a process of speaking to Turokuro, and we in previous versions of this used an example from their lands and their lineage as well. So that moment of acknowledging what's happening and saying, actually, I can shift something in this moment. This is something that can be addressed. I have definitely also been in situations, though, where a conflict has been raised. And if I were to map the conflict, much larger and much deeper needs were being activated. Definitely personal and systemic triggers that were much bigger than the space itself. And I think I've been in multiple situations. I'm sure we've all been in multiple situations they can think of in this instance. And in those moments, I think the question needs to be, how do we agree to come back to this outside the space when we have more time and capacity, when we're not fighting against, 1 or 2 days of impact related. I don't want to say impact. I don't want to say that in a way that devalues relational times, but knowing that we're gathering for a purpose connected to a deeper why. And we may not have capacity to get into this in the way that we need to, particularly if emotions are high. Not putting pressure on any form of resolution or decision around what repair could look like in that moment, but just communicating in a way that creates space for the option to come back to it if the people involved wish. So not saying shut it down, saying let's come back to this and come back to it. And that's the other part, making sure you do come back to it, even if it's realizing that there may not be a resolution. The problem I think that can happen is that we push it down and pretend it isn't happening. And that also came up actually in our group discussion, that someone mentioned that if in the situation where someone left the room, they would have felt more stressed if we just ignored it and pretended like it didn't happen, as opposed to opening up a conversation and saying, okay, this has happened. How are we going to navigate this? How can we come back to this if we feel like we can't hold this now? Yeah, and I'll just say firsthand, I'm still learning this. At times I've definitely been too boundaried, and I could have extended more care. And at other times I think I felt the pressure to resolve a conflict in a moment and really moved from that place of reactivity. And that's become the focus at the expense of others and their intentions for being in the space as well, who I also have a responsibility to consider as a facilitator. So it's a tricky dynamic, but I think that what I would like to get better at is practicing asking that question and then figuring out, okay, if it's later, what do we need to communicate in this moment in a way that everyone's mana, I guess, is intact to be able to come back to it if needed. Amazing. We have 10 minutes, which is exciting. It's exciting only because I'm so used to going over time with things. But I actually wanted to put a question out to the group. Also we can just use it as more of a discussion space, but I'd love to hear what processes you've been through, you've seen or you've used or learned from, and your key takeaways from that, even things that you felt didn't work. And also just a second question is just, are there any part of any of this that makes you nervous? Those are the two questions I might throw out to the group. And you can turn your mic on and just share into the chat. You're also welcome to, just speak, or you could also share into the chat and I can read some of this out. Oh, I love this. I've been in Maori spaces where they allow and inform people of this prior, that when you feel, sorry, I can't actually see that word because I've got a little block. Oh, hoha. Can be any type of hoha. You can take a walk or a break from the space, then come back. Beautiful. I imagine that was you talking about the looping back up to step one. Yeah, but I'd love to open it up. Or even if anyone had any reflections or questions as well.
I am happy to go first. Um, I thought it was really interesting when you had the pyramid and you were talking about the need, because I feel like it's very easy to figure out what the first two are,
Mm.
especially sometimes in conflicts in groups where, like, again, there's like time pressure, there's a lot of stress. You hear what's being said, but you're not thinking about like the feelings and the deeper issues. And so I feel like for me, the takeaway or like the question that I have to myself is like, how can I upskill myself to
Mm.
hear what's not being said when people are talking and actually like figure out what are the deeper, fears that they might have, um, to hopefully navigate the space better.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it is a practice. I've so we Noor and I co-facilitated a version of this for a conference, and we actually ran an activity where people did this, and it was fascinating. Because a lot of actually what came up was people being like, yeah, I can see the position and need, but um I think it's a bit silly. Essentially was sort of what was communicated. And it was really interesting because I'm like, the exercise is actually just to extend curiosity, not to place a judgment or a value on whether you agree with it or not, but it's about getting to a place of understanding. And we can unpack and we can understand and we can develop empathy without us excusing behavior or without us saying that that makes it okay. But it's knowledge, right? It's like when you know where someone is coming from, that is such an important input um, to know how to engage in what comes next. And yes, actually, soften our hearts in the process of doing that as well. Oh, we've got some great stuff in here as well. Rihanna feeling excited to practice being in conflict. I love that. AORTA, Aorta, and Climate Justice Organizing Hub have great workshops and resources. They're based on Great Turtle Island, slightly different context, but still cool. That is awesome. Thank you so much, Lourdes. That's great to hear and share. Been in a Wananga context and seeing the power of Waitata as a tool of repair after a major disagreement. It was a beautiful form of collective acknowledgement shared by the whole group. Oh, Waiata, sorry, Waiata. Um, Waiata sing is that singing? Practice of singing? Oh, that's so gorgeous. I love that. Laughter, humor does wonders. Not to make light though. No, no, absolutely, absolutely. Um, yeah, yeah, particularly in that releasing the charge space. How can you find moments of lightness? God, we got to find lightness in this work as well. Uh, yeah, I agree. I think it can be so regulating. Um, beautiful. Any other final reflections? Also, very happy to give you folks 5 minutes of your evening back, knowing that it's super late on your end. Practicing with besties and flatmates. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, practicing. And I can't stress how much, and Kazi says this as well. At the back of his book, Healing Resistance, he has what he calls nonviolence weights. And he starts at like 0 to 5 kgs, 5 to 10 kgs. And it's sort of like the things you can practice to build up this skill of how to engage in conflict. And it's so fantastic. Again, it's a roadmap. But what he says is it is a practice like anything. And he sort of uses the example of if I've been learning, like I'm not gonna, I think he used karate, as an example. And he was like, the difference of someone who's been practicing before they step into a situation versus someone who hasn't is huge. It's just like anything. The more we practice, the more, the more resourced, I guess, we are to be able to navigate. Ask questions, seek to understand, but stand strong on values. Highlighting shared values, yeah, can be effective. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if there are any kinds of key phrases you use to guide someone into finding out what their need is. So supporting another person to unpack what their need is. I think sometimes actually pausing to name the feeling can help, because I think the thing that comes to mind, it's such a random example, but I really feel like this is the process I went through, is a conversation with my parents. My partner and I are getting married, and we've been together for 10 years. My parents are big on marriage. We're not as big on marriage, but we have decided to get married. And we talked about having the wedding earlier in October, and we sort of were tentatively going to do that. There was a lot of excitement around it. Then we talked about it. My partner and I talked about it some more and realized, actually, let's do it in March. That gives us more time. And so I just had this conversation with my parents on the phone, just letting them know, hey guys, we're just going to push it back to March, actually. And the reaction was so big. It was like I'd canceled the wedding. It was like I'd canceled the wedding. And I think what helped in that moment was actually pausing and being like, and for me, pausing and saying, like, hold on, this is what is happening. Like, what is actually happening under this? And actually pausing to like asking them to just sort of be like, what's going on for you in this moment? Like, what are you feeling? Because I think that when you're asked that question, it gives you permission to stop and actually think about the feeling, as opposed to, like, the reaction. And actually what I found is, if you can see what might be a need, if you're able to spot potentials for might be going on underneath, like gently offering that in. So I think for me, I was able to gently offer into it, like, is it just that actually guys were so looking forward to it, and that the thought of pushing it back is making you anxious? Or do you have some sort of fear that we're not gonna get married because we've been together for 10 years and we haven't? And actually putting some suggestions into the space helped my mom in particular sort of calm down, and then actually be able to communicate that, oh yeah, it is that, or actually, oh no, it's not, it's this thing. So those are the things that I found helpful. Like what are you feeling? I'd love to know a bit more about what's underneath this. Like, I see that you're really upset. I hear that feeling, and I hold that, I acknowledge it. I really want to understand more about what's going on. And then also, yeah, if you can see things that another person might not be able to see in that moment, how do you gently bring it in? Oh, we are now at 7:30. Oh, so much for being on time. This is awesome. These are people are sharing more great things in the chat, which is great, which is really great. And I just wanted to, I forgot, end just with this, because I think it's so excellent. Conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen. So it's inevitable. In this work that we're doing, it's going to happen, especially when we're building relationships. So if we can shift from thinking of conflict as something to be avoided to conflict is inevitable and it's going to happen, to actually conflict has the potential to really transform our relationships and create more vulnerability and lean in and learn, it can just have such a transformative impact, I think, on the strength of our movements and how we build together. Beautiful. What's happening inside of me right now, and can I be with it? That's such a beautiful question. Amazing. Yes, I will share the resources we discussed, and please just feel free to reach out to me directly as well if you have any questions. I'll just leave that up. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anisha. I'm just gonna quickly close us off. This was such a great 2 hours of just taking in your knowledge and your wisdom. So I'm so grateful and thankful that you shared it with us. I feel like this really has opened the door for us to be creative with the way that we go around conflict, you showing the examples and the different ways people kind of went about it. I feel like, is inspiring. And something about being creative also takes the weight off of it. And like, we can go back to our culture bring, what we know into the present, but also change it depending on the context and the situation that we're in. And so, yeah. I also big thank you to everyone that came to this session on this beautiful Monday evening. I hope you enjoyed the space as much as I did, and I will just close us off with a short blessing. May the love that binds us in solidarity be the guide in all we do. May the threads of humanity continue to weave through us in all that we do. May we never forget the honor it is to be here as guests on these lands.